All right, so back to our map here. Right? But as the war goes on, right, things are going to start to move into the Allied favor. And by 1943, the Allies are landing in Italy. Down here, you can barely see it on this little map, right? But needless to say, down here is Italy. And the Canadians are going to distinguish themselves in the fighting in Italy. Italy is a little weird because Italy is a enemy country, right? They are one of the major powers of the Axis. It's the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians. But by 1943, the Italians had surrendered. The Allies had landed in Italy. The Italian army had surrendered for the most part. And the Germans, though, decided, well, we're not giving up that easily. And they sent German troops to reinforce the Italians and stop the Allied invasion in Italy. Canada is going to really produce some of the extraordinary fighting in Italy. Not on their own. The Canadians are not going to be the only ones who are there, but the Canadian Army is really going to prove themselves here fighting in Italy. And especially at a town known as Ortona. It's really a small city. The Canadians are going to fight the Germans building by building, street by street. They're really going to distinguish themselves. They're going to fight these German paratroopers and really elite troops, and they are going to capture the city of Ortona. So the Battle of Ortona is one of Canada's greatest achievements in World War II. You guys don't need to know like tactics and how they did it, but this is really one of those times that the Canadians are going to basically fight this battle on their own, and just like Vimy Ridge in World War I, right? This is the battle of World War II that proves Canadian determination. Moving up here a little bit. So back to our map then. So that's 1943 in Italy. And as the war is progressing then, right, the key thing, DDay and the Battle of Normandy, right, the Allied invasion of France. Now, you can read this. Feel free to, right? The Canadian forces are going to land, before I do that, June 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of France. Quick note, the invasion forces are divided among 5 beaches. The Americans are going to land on Utah and Omaha Beach. If you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, that's Omaha Beach. And the British and the French and the Canadians are going to land on 3 other beaches. The Canadians particularly are going to land on Juno Beach. Okay, these are all code names. They're not the real names of these beaches in France. Once they land on Juno on D-Day, June 6th, right, the Allied forces are going to move forward off of the beachhead and move forward into, deeper into France. By the end of D-Day, more than 155,000 Allied soldiers, 6,000 vehicles had landed in France. The German beachhead defenses were destroyed, and the door was open into France. Now, this is all a lot easier said than done, obviously. But by the end of June 6th, the Allies were in France to stay. And the Canadians had played a vital role in that. Oh, here it is, our map of the beaches, right? Utah over here, Omaha, Gold, and the Canadians landing here at Juno. This is, obviously, a massive undertaking that everybody is the Allies are partaking in. Once they land successfully in Normandy, now they have to drive into France and eventually on into Germany. And the Canadians, again, are going to play a major role in that. The Canadians are going to be assigned to go through the Netherlands and to Belgium. The Germans, obviously, are going to fight inch by inch, man by man. But as we all know, they're not going to be successful. Canada's role in this, one of the major parts that Canada is going to play is this. I don't think did I put the map in here? I don't think so. The Battle of the Scheldt Estuary. It's late 1944. They're in Belgium. The Canadian Army has reached the border, right, between France and Belgium. Not too far away are these Belgian and Dutch port cities that are going to be needed to keep the Allied advance going. They got to get supplies now. They got to get supplies from England over to the main into France. Okay? Between the Canadians and the ports, the Germans, they're going to be defending what's known as the Scheldt River and the Scheldt Estuary. Okay, that's the mouth of a large river. It's right where all the river and the ocean all kind of come together. The Germans are going to flood that so that the whole area is just one big area of muck. Miles and miles of farmland that are just underwater. Any Canadian advance is going to be very difficult. 5 weeks of fighting, though, our Canadian friends, they're successful. They're going to clear the Scheldt Estuary. They're going to capture the port city of Antwerp. This is vital. It's absolutely critical to the Allied success. That shipping now can come in directly from England. It could come from the United States. It could come from Canada, straight to Antwerp. This is where the Allied supplies are going to be coming in. They're going to be a lot closer to their supplies. This is vital that Antwerp is open, and the Canadians are going to be responsible for that, right? Because now the supplies are going to be much closer to where the armies are going to need them. Antwerp is so important that later on in 1945, sorry, I'm going to take a sip of coffee from my Disney mug. It's going to be so important that when the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944 and into 1945, that Antwerp is going to be one of the main goals of the German army. They have to stop the Allies from getting those supplies. They're not going to be successful because of the Allied resistance. So the Canadians have played a vital role, right, on the military front. Back at home, they're having a little bit of an issue, a second conscription crisis, right? We talked about in World War I, they had a conscription crisis where the French Canadians, right, did not want to go to the fight. Same thing happens here in World War II. Prior to 1942, the Canadian government had held a plebiscite. That's that word. We're going to see that again later on. The Nazis are going to like to use that too. This is just a vote, right? They're going to ask Canadians to release the government from its no conscription promise. Foolishly, the government had promised there was going to be no draft. 70% of the Canadians said, yes, of course we understand there can be a draft. But only 20% of the French Canadians in Quebec agreed with that. There was still that tension between the British Canadians, or the English Canadians, and the French Canadians. Our friend, Prime Minister King, he had been able to avoid the issue of conscription until 1944. He didn't want to anger the Quebecese, so he tried to push it off to the side. And enough people had volunteered to go to the war. They didn't need to have a draft. But obviously, the high casualties on the battlefields, the death, the wounded, it meant that by 1944, there was going to have to be conscription. And some of those soldiers were going to have to go over to Europe. Even though they decided to hold this draft or this conscription, the Quebecese didn't challenge it. They had domestic issues back home in Canada. They really didn't want to stir up trouble, so they didn't really protest it. So they ended up having this conscription. They did have the draft, but it seems like both sides understood that now was not the time to have this kind of tension. The government was basically able to continue the war effort, mostly with volunteers. 16,000 conscripted soldiers were sent over to Europe, but most of them never fought. Something like only 1,300 of them ever fought over in Europe. So, and when they did, it was only for a short time. So, yes, there was this conscription crisis, but for the most part, they seemed to avoid the massive tension that they came out of World War I with. All right. So those are some of the major events for Canada in World War II, military events. So what did they get out of it, right? When the war ends in 1945, what do they get out of it, right? For Canada, it was massively expensive, economically and socially. You can see the government spending went from $118 million in 1939, remember that's right at the end of the Depression, to $4.6 billion in 1945. 42,000 Canadians had died in the war, and over 50,000 had been wounded. And there was some tension between the English and French Canadians. Those are the bad things, right? I mean, that's massive spending, lots of deaths, more social tension between, and that's going to flare up later on, in Canada. But they did also benefit from the war. Right? The nation was transformed. Right? They had recovered from the Great Depression. They had a massive, efficient economy. Nobody had been bombed, right? Canada, the United States, the Latin American countries. Nobody got bombed. There were no battles in Canada. So, their factories were good. Their people were relatively safe unless they had gone off to fight the war. So, that's a massive bonus. It was considered a major party. It had a power. It had a large army and a large navy. And it really is going to institute this idea of a middle power, right? The United States obviously is going to come out of World War II as a superpower. Even the Soviet Union is going to be considered a superpower because of its massive army. Canada is going to come out as the idea of a middle power. It's not going to be a superpower. It doesn't even want to be a superpower. But it's strong enough, it's big enough, it's united enough to influence diplomacy around the world. It's all of those things that it can influence policy around the world. Something that it had never been able to do before. So World War II had a massive benefit for our neighbors to the north. The conscription crisis, yes, it highlighted some problems. But even despite of that, people came out of World War II as Canadians, right? This idea of a national identity for Canada. So definitely benefits of World War II for Canada. Ooh, that does bring us to the end of the slideshow. How can I change this? Let me see. What can I do? Oh, full screen. There we go. So, Canada, oh look, I stopped shaving. There it is. Canada comes out of World War II, tremendously changed, on the victorious side, which is obviously a lot better. And this new idea of a middle power. What you have to worry about, and the idea is, what role does Canada play in World War II? If you go on to Canvas now, you'll see that there is a little assignment talking about Canada's role, a little writing. It's not an essay, I swear. That I'd like you to take a look at. Use the video. Use any kind of comments here. One thing that is you do have to remember though is Canada is the junior partner. Maybe without the United Kingdom, obviously World War II would have worked out a little bit different. Everything that Canada did in World War II, the United States would have been able to do without them. Right? The Battle of the Atlantic, the battles that Canada fought in. Is it possible that they were sideshows to what was going on? Definitely. In the writing assignment, I want you to think about your own thoughts on that, on what might have happened. Okay? If you have any questions, send me a message, obviously, and hopefully we'll be able to do this again in the future. All right, peace.